The 1962 Seattle World's Fair, also known as the Century 21 Exposition, was all about the future. But its politics were also rooted in the present. The fair organizers desperately wanted the presidential seal of approval. They wanted President Kennedy to visit the fair. It didn't happen. Or did it? The fair was born in the era of the Sputnik-driven space race of the 1950s, and by the early 1960s, there was a president who embraced the new frontier. Satellites and astronauts were starting to go into space. Seattle wanted to position itself as a space-age town. Fair organizers were planning for President Kennedy to come to the fair, but he wasn't able to. He opened the fair over the telephone from Florida.
By closing this key, may we open not only a great World's Fair, may we open an era of peace and understanding among all mankind. Let the fair begin.
Then they were hoping for a consolation prize, that he would come to the closing of the fair, which he said he would do. In October of 1962, as the fair was wrapping up, Kennedy pled sickness. He was too ill to come. In fact, he wasn't ill. He was stuck in the White House dealing with that little thing called the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Of the Soviet military buildup on the island of Cuba.
The fair was wildly successful, but Seattle felt a little snubbed. But it turns out that JFK did visit the World's Fair site. He came to Seattle in November of 1961 to give a speech at the University of Washington. But he took a slight detour on the way to the University of Washington. He drove through the World's Fair site under construction. He passed through the street that stood between what became the Fun Forest, then known as the Gateway, and Memorial Stadium, right at the base of the Space Needle. The motorcade was originally supposed to stop at the Space Needle, but the security people wouldn't have it, so it simply sped on by. He got a brief glimpse of Seattle's vision of the future, but we also got a brief glimpse of him. Proof of President Kennedy's drive-by lay in a closet for over 50 years. A photographer named George Golosick was hired to document the construction of the Space Needle, and he visited every day. We have his daily diary of activities during the construction of the Space Needle. So, for example, on November 13th and 15th, he noted that skirt plates were installed on the Space Needle's legs. But on November 16th, George had a really interesting note. He said that the president passed through, his motorcade didn't stop, and he visited the Century 21 site. It was something George obviously witnessed from his perch on the Space Needle. And he did more than that. Lo and behold, George took a couple of fairly grainy photographs from about the 100 level of the Space Needle of Kennedy's motorcade coming through. George, from his perch on the Space Needle, managed to capture a grainy glimpse of history in the making. If you blow the picture up and look very carefully, you can see President Kennedy's familiar hair profile in the back of the lead car of the motorcade. President Kennedy's visit was very brief. But that brief moment of Camelot in Seattle was captured by a photographer for all posterity. As far as I know, this is the only photo of JFK at the World's Fair site. But if you look at the picture closely, you can see in the crowd that there are other people with cameras. So there may be other photographs out there. If you dig in the closet or some attic, there may be a print or a negative or a contact sheet showing another angle on this moment of history. If you find it, send it to me.